possible. All right. Well, we have CL here. For those of you who are tuning in for the first time, CL Edwards is a former Salafi Muslim, right?
Yes, I was upon the Adawat Salafiyah.
So, and matter of fact, maybe we should just break everything down as we go along. Salafis are the more conservative Muslims, to put it mildly.
Yes.
Yeah. What is a Salafi by definition? How would you define
By definition, Salafi is from the word Salaf, from the Salaf as-Salih, which were supposed to be the first three generations of Islam, which you would think the closer you are to the original source of something, the purer it would be. So it's a call, a movement that started sometime like in the 17th century in Arabia, saying we need to get away from all this Sufism and all this other stuff. We need to get back to the Qur'an and to the Sunnah as it was understood by the original Muslims, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century.
And Muhammad himself said that, right? He was asked, what's the greatest generation of Muslims? He said, my generation. And what's the next best?
And
following generation. What's the next best? The following generation. And that actually kind of relates to our topic, because if I were a Muslim, I would have to be a Salafi. Right? I wouldn't be something else. I would be...
The beard and the...
No question, no question. For those of you, for you Salafis out there, you Salafis who are watching this, I don't agree with Islam. I reject Muhammad as a prophet. But if I were, God forbid, to believe in Muhammad as a prophet, I would be a Salafi, right? I'm not going to be some modern reinterpreter, or I'm not going to go with what later generations of Muslims said. I'm going to have to go with what Muhammad said, and I would have to go with Muhammad, his companions, the rightly guided caliphs. And so, yes, I would be in the same boat with you. And we're also talking about the Apostle Paul today. And
he's the guy that changed the law of God and made up a new religion after Jesus left, right?
Well, yeah, you as a Muslim, you would have to believe something like that. But I'm pointing this out because I heard a preacher one day describe the Apostle Paul when he was Saul of Tarsus, so before he became a Christian, as the original Osama bin Laden. Because he's going around trying to terrorize Christians, right? He's running around trying to kill and round up everyone who disagrees with the true teachings of God. And so I think if Paul had ever become a Muslim, if he had come along several centuries later, I think he would have been a Salafi. In other words, there are certain people who, just personality-wise and mindset-wise, if we are going to believe in something, we have to take it seriously, and we have to stick to the core teachings, not reinterpret things the way we like to, right?
But if Paul was alive during the time of Muhammad, wouldn't Paul would have had to try to kill Muhammad for being the innovator of the Torah?
Now you're talking about Saul of Tarsus before he became a Christian. Yeah. When he became a Christian, when Paul converted to Christianity, he would have stood up to Muhammad. He would have refuted him, and Muhammad would have had to kill Paul. Muhammad would have had to have killed him, just like the Roman Empire had to kill the Apostle Paul. So that's the direction we're going to be going in tonight. And for those of you who haven't had a lot of discussions with Muslims, there's a very important reason for comparing Paul and Muhammad. Muhammad, according to the Quran, told his followers that Jesus was a devout Muslim. And not just a devout Muslim, he was a prophet of Islam. Not only was Jesus a devout Muslim, his followers were also devout Muslims. So think about this. According to the Quran, Jesus and his followers are Muslims. So are other prophets that you're familiar with in the Bible: Moses, Abraham, Noah. These were all Muslims according to Islam. Now, that would work out quite well if you're preaching in Arabia in the 7th century, because most of your followers don't know anything about historical investigation, and so they don't know enough to realize that there's no way Jesus was a Muslim. So that would work very well there, but Islam spread and eventually ran into people who knew the historical method, are familiar with the 1st century documents, and people who know that there's no way Jesus was a Muslim. So if you're a Muslim and you want to reconcile Muhammad claiming that Jesus was a devout Muslim with anything resembling historical investigation, which tells us Jesus claimed that he would die on the cross for sins, that he rose from the dead, and that he is the divine Son of God. If you want to try and figure out what you're going to do with this, because the evidence just doesn't fit with what Muhammad said, you need to blame someone. You need to blame someone for changing all of the evidence, right? The evidence had to be changed, because the evidence we have tells us Jesus was the divine Son of God, who died on the cross, rose from the dead. Islam denies all of those core teachings. So if Jesus was a good Muslim, he wouldn't have taught those things. So where did those things come from? Well, now you need someone to blame. But since Jesus was a good Muslim and a prophet, you can't blame Jesus. You can't say Jesus corrupted the message. You can't say Jesus preached a false message. So the point here is that there are people in the world who don't believe in Jesus, and if you tell them Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, you say, so what? I don't care what Jesus said. Right? There are people who would say that. Muslims aren't allowed to say that because they believe he is a prophet. So they can't just say Jesus made up things, or Jesus was crazy, or Jesus was a deceiver. They can't say those sorts of things. So they can't blame Jesus, nor can they blame Jesus' close companions, because those were, according to the Quran, devout Muslims as well. So you can't say those devout Muslim followers of Jesus totally corrupted his message. These were the followers that Jesus converted during his ministry as a Muslim. And you can't say that Christianity was corrupted long after the first century. If you're talking to a Muslim who really just has absolutely no clue what he's talking about, he might say something like, Christianity was invented, the deity of Christ was invented at the Council of Nicaea. You've heard this before, right?
Oh, yes.
Lots of times.
Do a search on the internet and you'll see 1,000 posts about this.
It all happened at the Council of Nicaea, right? And here's a problem. The core doctrines of Christianity, all of them, all of the doctrines of Christianity, you can trace right back to the first century. So unless you're willing to say that the Roman emperor had a time machine, and that the people of the 4th century had a time machine and went back, and after they corrupted it in the 4th century, then they went back in time and inserted it into 1st and 2nd century Christian documents, you've got a problem. So just as a general rule, if someone is, we know what happened at the Council of Nicaea. They kept notes at the Council of Nicaea. We know a lot about the Council of Nicaea. If you're talking to someone, they start talking about some Christian doctrine being invented at the Council of Nicaea, you'll just run into someone who has absolutely no clue what he's talking about. You can call him out on it. Where'd you get that from? Because he didn't get that from studying. He didn't get that from any respected scholar. So even though there are ignorant people who would attribute Christian doctrine to the Council of Nicaea,
Okay.
more educated people, and by the way, I'm not just talking about Muslims here. I'm talking about all kinds of critics of Christianity who want to say that the message was changed somewhere along the line. If we know that the doctrines of Jesus' deity, his sacrificial death, and his resurrection go back to the 1st century, you can't blame someone in the 2nd or 3rd or 4th or 5th century for inventing these things. You need to blame someone in the 1st century for corrupting the Christian message. Now, here's your problem. As a Muslim, you can't blame Jesus. You can't blame his closest followers. But you need someone in the 1st century powerful enough to corrupt the entire gospel. And who does that leave you with?
Paul.
That leaves you with Paul, right? So you have to blame Paul. So you Muslims out there who are saying, Paul corrupted Christianity, and Paul changed the message, and Paul distorted everything, and Paul was a deceiver, and Paul this, and Paul that. You didn't get that from any actual investigation of the Apostle Paul. You got the idea that Paul corrupted Christianity because you got nowhere else to go, right? You have to go with the Apostle Paul. You need someone 1st century who wasn't Jesus and who wasn't one of Jesus' close companions, and you need to pin this on someone. You need to blame someone for why the evidence we have does not line up with Islam at all. So you've got to blame Paul. But there's a problem here. Now, I could point out sort of the obvious, that according to the Quran, and maybe we will touch on this later in the program, according to the Quran, the gospel, the Injil, was given by who?
It was given by Allah to Isa ibn Maryam.
Allah delivered the gospel. And why did he do it? According to the Quran, this is chapter 3, verses 3 and 4 of the Quran, Allah gave the gospel as a guidance for mankind, right? So Allah wants to guide people with the gospel. So Allah wants to give this message to people. Now, if you say Jesus delivers the message, no, let's back up. Before Jesus delivers the message, Jesus is born of a virgin, miraculous sign. Jesus Did Jesus just live a regular life according to Islam?
Well, no, he spoke from the grave. I mean, from the cradle.
Yeah, so he's born, he starts preaching, right?
Yeah, it comes out the womb.
And it didn't stop there. It didn't stop there. He keeps performing. Jesus lives the most miraculous life in history. Jesus is sinless, and when people try to kill him, what happens?
Well, Allah made someone else look like Jesus and had him as a substitute for Jesus on the cross.
And Muhammad, of course, dies after getting poisoned by a Jewish woman. God didn't rescue him. He just lets him wallow in freakish misery and complete agony. Aisha said she had never seen anyone suffer as much as Muhammad. Muhammad was in agony after eating poison that he'd been given because he had slaughtered this woman's, many of the men in this woman's town, including many members of her family. And then she brings him dinner to eat, and let me have some of this. And Muhammad is poisoned. He suffers for a couple of years. It did internal damage to his system.
But isn't there a hadith saying that food used to speak to Muhammad?
Yeah, and that time actually did. It was just a little too late. It was after he got the poison, and then it spoke to him. It was a little too late. But here's the point. Muhammad dies in utter agony. When people try to kill Jesus, they don't succeed. Allah rescues him, takes him to himself, lets someone else die. That's the life. That's the life of Jesus. Much more spectacular than the life of Muhammad. And I'm not talking about according to Christian sources. I'm talking about according to Muslim sources. So God does all of that. Why? To confirm the gospel that he's giving as a guidance for mankind, according to the Quran. So Allah is giving this book as a guidance, and you Muslims want to tell me that after all those miracles, the Apostle Paul comes in there and corrupts it, and Allah can't stop him?
Now, by
the way, that's the theory, right?
Yeah.
That's the theory.
How long was it after Jesus resurrected did Paul begin his ministry?
There are some differences, but you'll see between 2 and 5.
So it was a guidance for 2 to 5 years.
Yeah. And then it was immediately corrupted by the Apostle Paul. He wiped out the original Islamic gospel, and Allah was just utterly helpless. So Allah gives the most miraculous life in history to confirm the message of the gospel, but Allah just can't stand against the Apostle Paul, who came in and wiped it all out. This guy must be more powerful than Allah.
Brother.
You're talking as a Muslim now, right?
Yeah. Maybe it was just abrogated. Don't you understand the doctrine of abrogation?
So he did all of those miraculous acts and works through Jesus in order to turn right around and abrogate it. And by the way, there's a point to this. It's how do you explain this, Muslims? How do you explain Allah going through all this work in order to corrupt the message? And I mean, in order I said I slipped there because that's the direction I was going in. Allah corrupted the message because here's a fact, Muslims. You can't just blame the Apostle Paul. As you pointed out, Allah disguised someone to make him look like Jesus. So belief in Jesus' death by crucifixion, that doesn't come from the Apostle Paul.
Doesn't the translation of the Quran, it says literally, he made it appear to them.
Made it appear to them.
Who made it appear to them?
Allah made it appear to the Jews that Jesus had been crucified, when in fact he hadn't. Allah had rescued him. So think about this. If you're a Muslim and you want to explain why the historical evidence doesn't line up with the teachings of Muhammad, you have to say that Allah, after inspiring the message, after giving Jesus all these miracles, after miraculously rescuing Jesus, Allah then corrupted the message by convincing people that Jesus died by crucifixion, when in fact he hadn't, and then the Apostle Paul came in and corrupted the rest. That's what you have to believe as a Muslim if you really want to think through these things. And so just going with that, right, we would have to reject that. Because that, my friends, is absolute blasphemy. You're accusing God of being a horrible deceiver who starts false religions for no reason and overthrows the work of his greatest prophets for no reason. And you're accusing him of being so weak and incompetent that he could not stop the Apostle Paul from corrupting his entire message. And that is utter blasphemy. Yeah.
But Paul talks about that the disciples, and there were 12 disciples, minus Judas, right? Mm-hmm. So 11 disciples. Mm-hmm. And doesn't he talk about there being over 500 people who saw the resurrected Christ? Mm-hmm. what were all these people doing while Paul was corrupting the gospel?
Yeah, and that's a problem. If you really wanted to go, because I've had lots of conversations with Muslims where you start narrowing things in on them. See, the Romans didn't like the Apostle Paul. They ultimately killed him. Right? The Romans didn't like the Apostle Paul. The Jewish authorities didn't like the Apostle Paul because he starts preaching that Jesus is the Messiah who died on the cross for sins and rose from the dead, and he's the divine Son of God. The Orthodox Jews didn't like the Apostle Paul. If you're telling me that he didn't line up, his message didn't line up with the teachings of the Christians even, who supports Paul? No one. The Romans didn't like him, the Jews didn't like him, the Christians didn't like him. This guy would have had no support from anyone. And so the only explanation for how Paul could have taken over is if Allah helped him. And isn't that what the Quran says? That Allah helped the true followers of Jesus until they took over? But
they had victory over the Jews who disbelieved until
the day of resurrection.
The resurrection. Yeah.
So this is the point is this is theologically incoherent. You cannot give me a coherent story about what happened that does not insult God, insult Jesus. Right? You can't do it, Muslims. There is no way. And if you have a view that you just cannot make sense of without massively insulting and blaspheming God, you need a new worldview. And that's what we've got to offer you. We've got a much better worldview. All right, let's go to another guest we have tonight to get his initial thoughts on this. Anthony, are you there?
It's great to be with you.
Hey, how you doing, brother?
Good.
Have you heard what we've been saying so far?
I have.
So what are your initial thoughts on this? We're going to go into some specifics here, but what do you think? Who do you like better, Paul or Muhammad?
Well, that's a no-brainer, and I think it would be for most people unless they've been sold a bill of goods and told something different about Jesus. And in fact, I think they also have to have been told something different about Muhammad in order to even, possibly consider choosing Muhammad over Paul. Just to go back over some of the things you guys mentioned, I wanted to point out something that you guys know that's interesting and relevant to bring up here. And that is that while Muslims definitely needed to find somebody to lay the blame, at their feet, the earliest Muslims, interestingly enough, didn't lay the blame at Paul's feet. In fact, just earlier I was reading Ibn Kathir's commentary on the Quran in Surah 36, verse 14. And there he refers to Paul, in Arabic it's Bulus, so if you read the commentary by Ibn Kathir, understand that's a reference to Paul. But it says that Allah sent two messengers, and these were not heeded, these weren't listened to. So then he sent a third, which was Bulus, Paul, to reinforce and help them so they might prevail. And so what's interesting here is not only that Paul is being referred to positively, according to Ibn Kathir, interpreting a Quranic ayah, he's not only being referred to positively, but he's being referred to as such a spiritual giant that he comes to the aid of two others who happen to be, according to Ibn Kathir, Simon Peter, and the other is John, Yohanan. So that just initially is, I think, very relevant. But then we have to ask, how did Paul ever become the scapegoat here if that wasn't the case for the earliest Muslims? And here I think it's very relevant for Christians studying Islam and interested in getting into apologetics to realize that basically Muslims are following the lead of apostate or liberal scholars who also are looking for somebody to blame. Right? We do have those, and these are in the minority, who would say, like Giza Vermes, or Vermes, who would say that all the blame should be, thrown off to the Council of Nicaea and Constantine and so forth, and a bunch of evil bishops. But most scholars recognize that, as you guys have mentioned, that we could go right back to the first century and find the teachings that Muslims blame on Paul already there intact. It doesn't wait till Nicaea to come around. But Paul is still a problem at this point, because if we just take the issue of Christology, when you look at Paul's writings, you don't find Paul, for example, trying to inculcate belief in the deity of Christ. In Paul's writings, the deity of Christ is already presupposed. That is, Paul doesn't try to get people to believe in the deity of Jesus, whereas formerly they didn't. Paul is already assuming it with those he's talking to. And so this is very troubling to scholars. Okay, they want to blame Paul, but Paul ends up being actually a thorn in their side. And we can go on with this, but the earliest Muslims didn't think Paul was to blame, and even the attempt to follow contemporary scholars isn't overly helpful when you realize that Paul is already preaching a doctrine that the congregations already embraced. So why did they embrace it? And this, in fact, goes back to your time machine illustration. Did Paul somehow go back in time and teach them these doctrines so that later when he came along and would talk to them, he could assume it? That just doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
And Al-Qurtubi as well also speaks approvingly of the Apostle Paul. And I think there's a reason for that. I think these Muslims had a deeper theology, right, where they're actually thinking, if I say Paul came in there and corrupted something, or if I say someone very close just came in there and wiped out what Allah had done so much to establish, I'm saying something about Allah there, right? In other words, if you say Paul came in and wiped out everything, you're not just saying something about Paul, you're saying something about Allah. You're saying Allah could not preserve his message. And so I think these guys had a deeper theology that would prevent them from just flippantly, oh, that guy did it, that guy did it. If they want to say later Christians came to misinterpret things and so on, well, that would make perfect sense given their theology. But if you want to say that Allah did all these things and then someone wiped it out, there are Muslims back then were very different from what you find today, right?
Could it be that they just affirmed the Gospels, but they actually never read them? So they didn't know that anything in it contradicted what they believed.
Yeah, and that is, I believe you could say that about the first few generations. But by the time you get to Ibn Ishaq, for instance, he's already aware of some of what the Gospel of John says. But yes, I would have to say that even some of the great Muslim scholars, even when Muslims had been interacting with Christians for centuries, didn't necessarily know a whole lot about what Christianity teaches. So it's easier for them to say that the original apostles, including the Apostle Paul, were true followers of Jesus. So it certainly makes sense, because lots of later Muslims, if they weren't very interested in studying the Christian scriptures, would have been in a situation similar to Muhammad. They hear some vague references to Son of God and this and that, and they hear these things, but they don't really know what they mean. They don't really know, and so they can say, well, you're not interpreting things accurately. What do you think?
That sounds very plausible. I wanted to point out something. Anthony brought up a great point when he quoted the tafsir of 36:13 through 29 about this. But also, if he was aware that Al-Tabari, in commenting on that, pointed out that's inside the verse that these, all three, were messengers and prophets, according to Al-Tabari. I found that very interesting.
Yeah. So we have the general idea here. We have a problem. We have the Muslim sources saying one thing, and we have the Christian sources saying something else. And the difference is you can be a Christian without affirming the Muslim sources, right? As Christians, you say, if someone comes up to me and says, Muhammad says this, I don't really care what Muhammad said, right? I mean, out of all the people in history that I would listen to tell me about God, Muhammad is last on the list. I would listen to a random guy on the street, walking down the street, talking to himself, tell me about God before I'd listen to Muhammad. Tell me about God. Based on what I know about Muhammad, he's just not trustworthy in any sense of the term. So as a Christian, we don't have to listen to Muhammad. But if you're a Muslim, you're supposed to listen to Jesus. And according to Muhammad, the messages line up. The message of Jesus lines up perfectly with the message of Muhammad. We go to the sources. We look to our historical sources about the life of Jesus. We are told as people of the Scripture in the Quran, what are we supposed to judge by? We're supposed to judge by the Gospel. That's Surah 5, verse 47. Let the people of the Gospel judge by what Allah hath revealed therein. So this is the Gospel we know. So we go to this Gospel, we try to judge by it, and Muslims say, oh no, that's been corrupted. Well, Allah doesn't say, go to a corrupted book. And if he did, why? I mean, if Allah knows that this book has been corrupted, why does he say, judge by the gospel, right? Why didn't he say, whatever you do, stay away from the gospel, it's been corrupted?
He was talking about the real gospel, the Injil.
Where's that?
Not your gospel.
Well, where is this real gospel?
That's the same question I asked Shadid Lewis a few months ago in L.A.
Yeah.
If he could show me the
he said this isn't the real gospel, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and see, that's a problem because here again, when we say that the Islamic position is theologically incoherent, Allah commands us, Surah 547, this is during the time of Muhammad. Muhammad is supposed to say to the people of the gospel, that's Christians, judge by the gospel. It even says in chapter 5, verse 68, we have no ground to stand upon if we do not stand fast by the Torah, the gospel, and the revelation that has come to us. What revelation has come to us? That's this. And you say it's not that. Well, what's he talking about then? He's telling me, I mean, put it this way, CL. It's a Quran, right?
Okay.
If you're a Muslim and I walk up to you and I say, hey, you, Muslim, judge by the Quran, what do you think I mean?
By the Quran.
Right. And so what if I go up and I say, you, Muslim, judge by the Quran, and I walk away, I don't explain myself. And then years later, my followers come up to you and say, oh, when he said Quran, he meant something totally different. Does that make sense? Why would I tell you to judge by the Quran when I mean something totally different from the Quran?
That's not the Quran. That's the translation of the meaning of the Quran.
No, it's got the Arabic in there. We got Arabic. We got Arabic in here.
You always find a reason or answer, don't you?
Yeah, well, I know I'm saying because this is incoherent, right? And that's the point. Wherever you go with this. So Allah commands Christians, not in the first, we're not talking about the 1st century. We're talking about the 7th century. The 7th century, Muhammad, with a revelation from Allah, tells the Christians, judge by the gospel.
So hold on. So you're saying the Quran says judge by the gospel, right? So implying that the gospel existed for people during that time who heard the original message to go to the gospel, open it up, see Ahmed's name, right?
Yeah.
And also, is it true that nowhere in the Quran does it imply that the gospel was corrupted?
No.
Nowhere.
According to the Quran, no one can change Allah's words, and that's the problem. No one can change Allah's words. The Quran, and here's the point, Muslims. The Quran doesn't just affirm the inspiration of the gospel. The Quran affirms the inspiration, preservation, and authority of the gospel. If anyone who believes in the gospel, is preaching some other message that doesn't line up with Islam, that person must be misinterpreting it. But the gospel cannot be corrupted. It has not been corrupted. Christians are commanded to judge by the gospel. And so here's your problem, Muslims. Where are you going? Your book tells us to judge by the gospel. You tell us not to judge by the gospel. The gospel has been corrupted. So who do we listen to? We listen to you or we listen to Allah? If we listen to Allah, we have to reject Islam. Because if we judge by the gospel, we have to reject Islam. So you don't want us to judge by the gospel, so you have to say, oh, Allah was talking about something else, which means Allah was telling us to judge by something we don't have, something we don't have access to, something that we can't find any record of in all of history. Why would Allah tell us, judge by a book that you don't have?
But
judge by a book that you've never heard of. Judge by a book that, if I tell you what the book is called, you're going to think it means this book when it means some other book that you don't have. Does that even make sense to you? Because that's what I'm hearing, yeah?
But haven't the scholars, your scholars, found, that the Bible was corrupted and there was earlier text that said something that was closer to what Islam talked about, what Muhammad's message was. And you just want to suppress that, don't you?
Absolutely not. And he's giving the standard things that we'll hear from Muslims who don't know a lot about what they're talking about. No. If you go to scholars, what you'll have is, yes, there are textual variants in the manuscript tradition. In other words, people who copy things and stuff, but we can spot those. You can spot a copyist mistake, right? If I try to copy down the New Testament, I'm going to make an error. I'm going to make several errors. I'm going to make probably a couple hundred errors as I'm going along, copying the entire New Testament. But if I make an error, does that change the text of the New Testament? No, because you have all these other books. You have all the other collections. You have it right here to check it. And that's how it works down through history. If someone makes an error, you can then spot the error because other people's manuscripts do not have that error. And so go with any actual scholar. Bart Ehrman, I would love it if Muslims would actually pay attention to Bart Ehrman instead of just saying, oh, he says there are differences in the manuscripts of the Bible and it can't be the Word of God. Don't just go with that. Actually pay attention to what he said because Islam, here's the bottom line, Islam doesn't need textual variants in the manuscript tradition. You need massive doctrinal corruption. You need massive changes of the doctrines of the deity of Christ, of Jesus' death by crucifixion, of his resurrection from the dead. And according to Bart Ehrman, if you go back as far as you can to, let's say, the Gospel of John, are you going to find a different message? No. No. Ehrman would be the first one to tell you you go back to the first century, Jesus' death, resurrection, and deity in the Gospel of John, so where are you going? All right, so do we need to take a break or should we go on? All right, we're going to take a break and when we come back, we're going to get into some specifics. We're going to compare Paul and Muhammad morally. How do their lives stack up against each other? We'll compare them intellectually. How smart are these guys? And we will compare them spiritually. On a spiritual level, whom should we trust?